1908, the British and the Dutch betrayed the African people again. Despite that, the ANC remained truthful to what is in the Freedom Charter, that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, which means, therefore, that we all have a joint responsibility, black and white, to find a solution to an outstanding question, which is the land question. And therefore, nobody should feel threatened by the process that is unfolding in Parliament. And I think you will all agree with me that there is a deepening moral degeneration. There is a triple challenge of poverty, unemployment, and inequality, which flows from the failure to address the land question. And if one drives around South Africa, you see the informal settlement, the squalors, the ambulances cannot transport the sick, the dead cannot be transported from those places. All this because of the problem resulting from our failure to address the land question. So this is not a matter of black against white. It is a problem facing South Africans, both black and white. So let's take hands and take it as part of this new dawn that President Ramaphosa is talking about. But before I keep quiet, let me say that to do so, we also need to address the obstacles in the law. The Land Restitution Act has created a bureaucracy, a big bureaucracy, and if you can take the salaries and the petrol allowances of the officials who are supposed to implement that act, we could have actually, Minister, managed to restore more than 4%. Maybe Parliament must just scrap that Land Restitution Act, and we must get retired judges to sit and hear these land disputes. We can, I think, get this process going fast. The other thing that must be addressed is what someone said about white farmers on land because of officials who have created a big business out of this process, corruption. So government has got to urgently deal with corruption because Honorable Member Maite Mashawan, I think corruption has also created the situation we find ourselves in. So in conclusion, allow me to say Parliament must look at the Land Restitution Act. Government must look at corruption and the process that is unfolding in Parliament. We want to assure you, May from Lamosa, we could not bring all the provinces here today, but today let's identify the critical issues so that when Parliament goes to the people, it's not just throwing stones and snakes at one another. We address the critical questions, and everybody will be given a hearing. And I want to assure you that we will listen to everybody, including the students at our universities. Therefore, let nobody feel threatened. This is taking forward what Honorable Mandela foresaw, a transformation of our society in an orderly manner. So President Ramaphosa, our national chair, and all of us are committed to an orderly transformation. This process is about an orderly transformation of our country. Nobody should feel threatened by it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Matoli. Honourable Member of Parliament, I am now glad to introduce our next speaker. She is Bulelwa Mabasa. She is the Director at Workmen's Attorneys, and she's been a director for 10 years. I think she holds the BA-LLB and several other postgraduate qualifications. And she's been an attorney for 14 years or so at the company. And her practice is quite broad, but today she's going to speak to us in the space of land restitution, land redistribution, and so on, as she has successfully represented several landowners and funders, community claimants, individual claimants, and investors in matters within the Land Claims Court. Please warmly welcome Ms. Mabasa.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I had a bit of a, I had anticipated that my contribution would be in a form of a panel. So I feel a little bit hijacked this morning. But let me first start by greeting the elders in the room. I heard Uma Malamusa speaking about the apparent absence of youth. So I hope I am correct in saying that perhaps I can be understood to be representing, the youth of the country. As the introduction goes, I am an attorney by profession, but let me maybe start off with a bit of a snippet on what brings my interest in this area of law. Growing up in Soweto, in a household in Meadowlands, in a household, full of aunts and uncles, there was this particular piece of artwork, and those who have particularly township upbringing will know exactly which one I'm talking about. It's inscribed Verna at the bottom. It is a picture of a black girl or a black child with a teardrop, and it captured me for whatever reason, and I asked my father at the time, why is this child crying and what is this picture about? There was something captivating about it. And my father's answer to that was that this child is crying because land was taken away from her. And for some reason that struck me, and that culminated into other questions about why I lived in Meadowlands, why I was in a 4-roomed house, when I entered the first multiracial school in my life. And then I suddenly realized that there are suburbs that have trees, clean air, and there was just a different feeling about going into a school where there were tennis courts and a very different world from what I understood. So that culminated into other questions about why South African society was the way that it was. And this was back in the mid to the late 80s. And so as I grew up, I obviously then wanted to study law, and I felt law was a specific area that would have, and help me unpack and understand the world as it was. Then I became a student at Wits University. I studied my BA. I did politics, sociology, philosophy, all these wonderful things, and I studied law. And the land question, the issue of landlessness, having been stuck, I think, subconsciously at the back of my mind, landed up in me doing my thesis when I did my postgraduate law degree on comparing the Zimbabwe Constitution, or the Lancaster Agreement, with what became Section 25 of the Constitution. So when I studied my postgraduate law studies, the Constitution was about 4 or 5 years old. And I think at the time we didn't have mechanics around, the Restitution of Land Rights Act and so on. So I find this moment for me personally to be quite a full circle moment, because then I would go on into practice, and again, the itch and the consciousness around landlessness landed up in me building a practice around land, and then that became a practice about representing all facets of society within land, whether that included a bank wanting to know whether or not they can invest in land that had land claims, or whether or not it was a community in Mpumalanga wanting to know whether or not they can fight against a big conglomerate of a commercial farmer, and also then representing land claimants, families and communities. So I find myself here today feeling like this is a full circle moment after 16 years in practice. So having given you that little bit of a background and not knowing that I was going to address you as an individual as opposed to in a panel form, I've written quite extensively and I've followed the debate that has happened in the last 20 years or so. I think the debate around land is quite rightly always fraught with emotion. I think it must be fraught with emotion. And that emotion is galvanized by what I call the thirst and hunger for land. What we've also seen is that land is the perfect poster child to elicit extremist retorts from both ends of the political ideological spectrum. And the result of this is that the level of debate has rarely ever culminated into facts about what is the actual overarching policy of land. What is the actual legal position? It doesn't culminate into facts and figures about what has actually happened since we've adopted our final constitution in 1996. It's also a subject of many frantic headlines and television sound bites. The dearth of reliable data around this topic has led to a lack of clarification about what the policy is, and has often then just stayed as rhetoric. So I think the wider population, especially the black majority, can hardly be blamed for viewing land as a metaphorical symbol, almost synonymous with the attainment of freedom itself, and an achievement of an achievement of triumph over a painful history of bloodshed and dispossession. I think it's also not an overstatement to venture an argument that says the systematic dispossession from land from indigenous populations of South Africa by the Dutch and English was in fact the catalyst, if not the sole foundation, that led to the formation of black organized political movements. The struggle, therefore, was always really about the struggle for land. And so we cannot talk about freedom, we cannot talk about democracy if we haven't addressed the issue of land itself. So, and there's also, what I've noticed, there's been this tendency, whenever we talk about land, we immediately want to assure business and commerce that, and that tendency is one that we must look at with caution. And the reason I say this is because Section 25 of the Constitution is a matter of social justice, first and foremost. Section 25 was not designed with, at the back of its mind, issues around just economy. So we must understand the question of land to be an issue that addresses what I would like to contribute to the discussion today is whether or not current policy and what our aspirations are in the Constitution are aligned. And I would like to ponder on that question and say, current policy as it's designed will not lead us to where we want to get to. And I say this because, as Honorable Minister has said, current policy is only premised on three things. That is restitution, that is redistribution, and also security of tenure. Restitution, by design, places an onerous burden on claimants to have knowledge about who their descendants were, which land was occupied, and yes, the Commission of Restitution of Land Rights Act has the duty to investigate and to mediate. But I'm sure you would not be hearing it from the first time that the support around the department is so woeful that the funding of restitution has dwindled over the years. And so we also place an onerous burden on a department that receives less than 1% of the national budget to take the responsibility of helping claimants in getting to the point where their claims are progressed and settled. So the Restitution of Land Rights Act, without the necessary support financially from government, has made it very difficult for claimants to find a place where their land claims have been settled. How many elders, how many families in black communities are able or have elders that have that knowledge to even get to that point where you're able to prove your claim? So I think restitution has systemic inherent challenges within it. The other challenge, of course, is that we've built what the Land Claims Court, which its duty is ultimately to approve land claims. But how does one get to court ultimately? You need access to legal representation. How many communities are able to have access to that legal representation that is required in order to get to a place where land claims are settled and finalized? So these are some of the challenges that we need to start thinking about. And then when we set a target, for whatever reason, around restitution, was that we wanted 30% of the land to be given back to communities. How is that addressing the issue? Because already if you're going to set a target of 30%, you're actually saying that there is no real intention to deal with the fundamental issue, which was dispossession on a large scale. So there isn't a wholesale policy that says that will result in the goals that we have set out for ourselves. So we've shot ourselves in the foot there. I know that it's also been said publicly that over the last 24 years, there's been an obsession with this willing buyer, willing seller principle, which is definitely not a principle that resides in our Constitution. I might be lambasted for this being an officer of the court, but the Land Claims Court's jurisprudence has itself fallen into that trap, because we have a plethora of jurisprudence that says market value is the biggest thing. But the Constitution clearly states that just an equitable compensation within it allows government to take each case based on its own merits, and it can possibly lead to a conclusion that says there's no compensation payable if you take into account the history of the acquisition of the land. And so I do not take issue with what is in the Constitution. The fundamental error that has happened is that the Constitution is yet to be applied. And we see the budget allocation over land restitution had a fundamental, a downward trajectory in terms of allocation since 2008. What is the magic around 2008? We know that the markets fell. There was the world's economic crisis in 2008. But what is also important was that and it cannot be an elephant in the room anymore. The origins of state capture happened just post-2008, which meant that land...
We're just coming out there of that land summit. It is day one and the debate continues around that. For now, though, we'll take a short break. When we come back, Belen Kirtley standing by with all your sporting highlights, as well as a discussion centered around that South African versus Australia match and the ball tampering saga. There's more when we come back.